Hello students, welcome to this video of mine. This is part of my lecture series on modernist literature. The link of this lecture series would be there in the description and also in this part of your screen at the top right corner of your screen. You just press the I button to view the other videos which are related to it. And in this video we are going to understand the term postmodern, and we will try to discuss the aspects of postmodernism, because if we understand postmodernism, then only we will have a comprehensive understanding of modernism, as both the terms are quite related to each other. So let us start. Now, postmodernism, this term, gained currency in the academia of Europe and North America, especially the Ivy League universities, in the 1970s. Before that, we do not get any very well developed notion of postmodernism. So the academia, the university teachers, became aware of the condition called the postmodern in the 1970s. And postmodernism primarily refers to the complex social, economic and cultural phenomena that emerged in the second half of the 20th century. So that is the post-war scenario would come to our discussion, and you have to think of the two world wars, you have to think of the rise of fascism, you have to think of the beginning of the Cold War, which came after the end of the Second World War, 1950s, 1960s, and it continued up to 1980s. Then afterwards, in the 90s, when the USSR got split into several small nations, there was also a trend towards multiculturalism, as the societies changed and the Western spaces, the spaces in the West, the countries in Europe and North America, accommodated several immigrants from various parts of the world. The cultures of the regions in Europe and North America changed drastically. It became multicultural. Whether the people wanted to be multicultural or not, that's a different question, but they were, in a way, had no choice, and gradually the government started to accept this and acknowledge this, and this also contributed to the development of the nature of Europe and American culture in the post-1950s world. You can think of globalization, you can think of the various sorts of art forms which were hitherto not considered to be proper art. They were considered to be pop art or popular art. Became a part of discussions in the academia. There was a rise of skepticism in the attitude, and here you have to think of the rise of the theory with capital T. So all these aspects are connected with the idea of postmodernism. Now, postmodernism refers to a critical attitude as well as an artistic approach that has influenced the development of several cultural practices like literature, visual arts, and theorizations upon society, art, politics that came into being from the 1950s. And one of the earliest uses of the term postmodern is found in Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History, which was published in 1954. He's a British historian who tries to define what is now known as post-modernity, the condition of being post-modern. And he defines it as an epoch in history which begins from the late 19th century and continues throughout the 20th century. So after modernity there was post-modernity, which begins in the late 19th century. If you see my video on modernity, you will get a clearer idea of what we know as modernity. So again, you have to go to the description of this video, or you can go to the top right corner of your screen and press the I button to get access to that video on modernity. Now, postmodernity marks a decline of older human values, which, as Toynbee would argue, came into practice with the Enlightenment. And the term postmodernity refers to both an extension of modernity and / or a new phase in modernity. So this is remarkable. Postmodernity doesn't refer to the end of modernity. Right, so you have to understand this very carefully. Postmodernity, there is no hyphen between post and modernity. And the absence of hyphen denotes the fact that this term postmodernity does not refer to any temporal departure. Rather, it's an extension of modernity. Now, if we try to understand the postmodern condition through the French philosopher and intellectual Jean-Francois Lyotard, we would get an idea of what we know as postmodernism. As Lyotard is one of the most important thinkers who would talk about postmodernism and who would speak about postmodern condition in a very comprehensive way. So in the Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, which was published in 1979, Lyotard considers postmodernism as an intellectual attitude that tends to subvert the overarching goals of modernity. So modernity claimed certain things, like it claimed to emancipate human beings from religious dogma. It claimed to emancipate human beings from tyranny, and arrived or proclaimed to arrive at an age of democracy, an age which is more egalitarian in nature. It promised to do so. But then these overarching goals were never fulfilled, and in fact, these noble goals of modernity actually resulted in certain ignoble scenarios. And that's why you will have the rise of fascism, the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century. Apparently, it definitely shows that we have progressed. We are now more civilized. But what are we doing with that civilization, with that knowledge that we have got? We are producing weapons. We are waging new wars. You can go to my video on the modern warfare, that is about the First World War, and how the context of the First World War is important to understand modernism, to know more about it. So, the contemporary cultural sphere is postmodern in nature, as the contemporary economic sphere is post-industrial in nature. So, the contemporary culture, that means the culture of the mid 20th centuries, and it continues even now. So that is the contemporary culture, and this contemporary culture is postmodern in nature. So we are living in the postmodern, as we are living in the post-industrial societies. So in the 19th century in Europe, we used to talk about industrial society, industrialization, the movement which came hand in hand with the rise of capitalism, with the rise of the middle class. And then now in the 20th century, we come to the social formation, which is post-industrial in nature. That doesn't mean that industries do not exist. Actually, we have an extension of that industrial age. So that is post-industrial. So never think that when something like post gets written before a word, it shows that there is a temporal departure. So the same thing would be applicable to post-colonialism and post-humanism, and so on and so forth. So the economic and political spheres in the postmodern era would be driven by what Lyotard means knowledge, or calls knowledge. Now this knowledge is different than the conventional sense of the term. So this knowledge is not apolitical in nature, but rather it's a commodity that would be used as a means to be powerful. So this is how Lyotard considers knowledge as the ultimate telos in the postmodern world. We are going to fight for knowledge, and this knowledge is not something which is apolitical, which is about knowing something neutrally. It's a commodity. The most powerful in the contemporary world would then be the ones who would own the most of the knowledge resources. So it's about the war which goes on over resources of knowledge. You can think of the information technology industry, the IT industry, which boomed in the post World War era, especially in the 1970s and 80s in Europe, and then it subsequently spread across several countries which are known as the so-called third world countries like India. So you can think how this IT industry, this communication boom which came in the later half of the 20th century, contributed to this knowledge economy. The transaction of knowledge, the commodification of knowledge, the transaction of knowledge as a commodity, all these things became very, very pertinent and almost palpable in the later half of the 20th century. And the control over media and communication technologies would become the mainstay of the power in the postmodern world, according to Lyotard. In fact, you can think of Michel Foucault's definition of power over here, where he is again talking about the power-knowledge continuum. So knowledge as a commodity would only be possessed by the economically powerful sections. Again, the economically powerful people would be rulers, but now they are not going to own material, so-called material wealth, but they would materialize knowledge, which is spiritual in nature, which is not material in nature, so to speak. So this knowledge-driven economy is ultimately governed by the mores set by the powerful capitalists who own communication technologies. So those who own communication technologies would be more powerful. You can think of the way in which in our world, the very news, the very facts which we get through the new media